Project Nightmare was a classified government operation, shrouded in secrecy and darkness. It was designed to create a deadly virus as a military preparedness tool, in response to the fear of a similar biological attack from China. The virus was engineered to be highly contagious and lethal, with the intention of being released on a controlled population in order to practice and test the government and military's ability to handle and contain such an outbreak. The virus was manufactured in a top-secret lab, hidden deep within the mountains of Wyoming. The government chose this location due to its remote and sparsely populated nature, with no major sports teams or celebrities to attract attention. The state's wide mountain range enclosed the state, providing a natural barrier that would minimize the risk of the virus spreading beyond its borders. The government believed that releasing the virus in this remote location would make it easier to keep the story from reaching the outside world, and once the experiment was over they detonated one of the many nuclear warheads in Wyoming, wiping out all evidence of the experiment and any remaining zombies. But as the virus began to spread, it quickly became clear that the government's plan had gone horribly wrong. The virus was designed to be highly transmissible, creating hordes of aggressive and highly contagious individuals with symptoms similar to rabies and hemorrhagic fever. It was created by combining the genetic material of a rare strain of rabies and Ebola, two of the most deadly viruses known to man. The scientists behind the project worked tirelessly to perfect the virus, ensuring that it would be transmissible through bodily fluids such as blood, saliva, and any fluids from an infected person. Those who were unlucky enough to be infected found themselves consumed by fever, headache, muscle pain, and fatigue. As the virus progressed, it began to cause severe bleeding, both internally and externally. Blood poured from their eyes, ears, nose, and mouth, as if their very vessels were bursting at the seams. But the true horror was yet to come. The virus rewired the infected brain, turning them into aggressive, relentless monsters with a single-minded goal: to spread the virus to as many people as possible. The government's attempt to create a military preparedness tool had instead unleashed a nightmare upon the world. The virus was unleashed, and the government activated their ultimate weapon, an artificial intelligence known as ARTI. This AI was programmed to scour the internet and television, hunting for any mention of the outbreak. It would swiftly take down any news stories and ban any online accounts associated with the posters, keeping the rest of the country and the world in the dark about the true horror of the outbreak. As the virus spread and the death toll rose, the government made the decision to cut off all electricity and internet access to the citizens of Wyoming. This was just the beginning of their plan to contain the outbreak. The next step was to establish military roadblocks on every road and highway leading out of Wyoming, effectively turning the state into a prison. Large fences were erected on the border of the state, where the mountain range alone was not enough to keep the infected from spreading. Finally, teams were assigned to release small EMP blasts on the highway leading into the state, ensuring that no unsuspecting travelers would stumble upon the project. With everything in place, the military brought in 100 prisoners and infected them with the virus. Their bodies immediately began to rot and turn a sickly pale color, their eyes turned red, and their once human features twisted into something monstrous. They became stronger, faster, and more aggressive, driven only by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. As the virus consumed their minds, they were filled with rage and confusion, a stark reminder of the true cost of playing God. The newly turned zombies were then loaded into 3 wide-load, reinforced semi-trailers and transported to Frontier Mall. The glass pane doors at the mall were shattered as the semis were backed through, their trailers opened, and the swarms of the undead were unleashed on the unsuspecting shoppers. The once vibrant metropolis was rapidly consumed by the undead horde, with the government and military watching in horror as the streets were filled with the screams of the living. They were hunted down and devoured by the relentless zombies. The military and government slowly realized that they were powerless to stop the spread of the virus. The air was thick with the stench of decay and death. The streets were littered with the bodies of the fallen, their lifeless eyes staring blankly into the void. The once thriving city was now a nightmare landscape, overrun by the zombies and the memories of the innocent lives that were lost. The government and military could only stand by and watch as the virus consumed everything in its path, leaving nothing but death and destruction in its wake. They could only regret their decisions and the consequences of their actions. The mall, once a place of commerce and leisure, now a tomb for the living, overrun by the relentless horde of the undead. The sound of the zombies' moans and the smell of rotting flesh hung heavily in the air, as the survivors were trapped and surrounded, with no hope of escape. The undead roamed the mall, Dragging their decomposing bodies through the blood-soaked floors, the survivors were left with no choice but to fight for their lives, as they were consumed by fear and desperation. The government and military were quickly losing control as the virus spread. The once beautiful city was now a war zone, with the living fighting for survival against the relentless horde of the undead. The once bright lights of the mall were now flickering and dim, casting eerie shadows on the blood-soaked floors. The sound of gunfire and screams echoed through the halls, as the living fought to survive. The once bustling stores and restaurants were now overrun with the undead, their windows smashed and their interiors ravaged. The escalators and elevators were clogged with the bodies of the fallen, as the survivors were pushed to the brink of desperation. The military and government officials watched in horror as their plans for containment failed. The virus was now out of control. They could only stand by helplessly as the city was consumed by the undead horde, the once thriving metropolis now a ghost town, overrun by the walking dead. The streets were filled with the sounds of moans and growls, as the zombies roamed the city, hunting for their next victims. The government and military were left with no choice but to abandon the city, leaving the survivors to fend for themselves. The city was now a nightmare, a place where the living were doomed to fight for survival against the relentless horde of the undead. The virus slithered through the population like a serpent, striking without warning and consuming all in its path. The infected, driven by an unquenchable thirst for human flesh, prowled the streets in search of their next victim. They were relentless, attacking anyone and everyone they encountered, spreading the contagion with each kill. The military, realizing the gravity of the situation, threw all their resources into containing the outbreak. They erected more barricades, deployed more troops, and set up even more quarantine zones, but it was all for naught. The zombies breached their defenses, overwhelming the soldiers and turning them into victims themselves. The soldiers fought bravely, but their bullets were powerless against the sheer numbers of the horde. As the virus spread to the neighboring state of Colorado, it crept into small towns and bustling cities like a silent predator, stalking its prey in the shadows. The government, in a desperate bid to contain the outbreak, shut down the entire state, cutting off all power and internet access, and barricading the highways to prevent the infected from escaping. But it was too late. The virus had already spread beyond their control, and there was no stopping the nightmare that was about to unfold. The entirety of the military was called in to contain the outbreak, but they were ill prepared for the scale of the disaster. The infected overwhelmed them, and soon the soldiers were fighting a losing battle against the hordes of the walking dead. As the situation grew more dire, the government began readying their departments to activate their last-ditch plan, to use nuclear warheads to wipe out the infected and contain the outbreak. Knowing that the blast would also destroy neighboring states, but believing it would soon be necessary to prevent the virus from spreading any further. The news cycle for the following weeks were filled with stories of the United States relinquishing their position of global police, with tens of thousands of soldiers being brought back home to be promptly sent to Wyoming and Colorado to continue the fight of holding back the horde. Fear and panic began to grip the nation. People started to understand that this was not a small, contained outbreak, but a full-blown catastrophe that threatened the very existence of the country. The military mobilization was unprecedented, with thousands of soldiers being pulled from overseas and sent to fight in Wyoming and Colorado. The government tried to assure the public that the situation was under control, but as the horde continued to spread, it became increasingly clear that the outbreak was spiraling out of control. Rumors began spreading of nuclear war and a zombies apocalypse, and the panicked population began to stockpile supplies and prepare for the worst. People were afraid to leave their homes, as the horde was reported to be closing in on major cities. The government issued official statements urging people to remain calm, but the fear and panic were palpable. As the horde reached the outskirts of major cities, the military was forced to take drastic measures to try and stop the spread of the infected and undead. Reports began to surface of the use of chemical and biological weapons, and people were horrified by the devastating consequences for both the horde and innocent civilians. The military's efforts, however, proved to be in vain as the horde continued to ravage the land, spreading fear and chaos in its wake. People were trapped in their homes, unable to leave for fear of being infected or killed. The government's attempts to maintain order were futile, as the infected and undead continued to ravage the streets. The fate of the upper northwestern states, and possibly the entire country, hung in the balance, as the horde continued to ravage the land and the panicked population prepared for the worst. The outbreak had become a full-blown catastrophe, and it seemed that there was no end in sight. The rumors of nuclear war and zombies apocalypse were not longer just rumors, but a terrifying reality that people were facing. The fear of the unknown and the uncertainty of the future was the scariest thing of all. As the days passed, the streets of Colorado were filled with the moans and cries of the infected, and the sky was thick with the smoke from burning buildings. It was as if the end of the world had come, and there was no escape. The government's plan to contain the outbreak had failed, and now they were left with only one option: to sacrifice entire states in order to save the rest of the nation. 2 months after the release of the virus, the world was plunged into chaos. The initial outbreak was bad enough, with hospitals overwhelmed and streets filled with the sick and dying. But things only got worse when the final stage was initiated to cut off the spread of the virus. 4 ICBMs were launched and detonated, decimating every state from Washington to Kansas, leaving millions dead and creating a nuclear wasteland. The destruction was unparalleled. Entire cities were reduced to rubble and ash. The skies were filled with thick clouds of radioactive dust, making it difficult for survivors to breathe. The death toll was staggering, as the nuclear blasts not only killed millions but also created a breeding ground for the virus to thrive, making it even more deadly. The military across the country was quickly overwhelmed, with soldiers falling to the virus or being torn apart by the infected. The electrical grid failed, leaving entire cities in darkness and chaos. The government struggled to maintain control, but as the virus spread, so too did the number of the walking dead. They roamed the streets in hordes, hunting for their next meal. As the death toll rose, the government implemented emergency measures, but they were woefully inadequate. Cities were sealed off, but the virus always found a way in. Martial law was declared, but the military was unable to hold back the tide of the infected. People were left to fend for themselves, as the government struggled to provide aid and support to the survivors. The virus would claim the lives of nearly everyone in the country, leaving behind a barren wasteland, filled with the rotting corpses of the infected and the memories of those who had been left behind to face their terrifying fate. The once great nation would be reduced to a ghost town, a warning to the rest of the world of the dangers of playing with the unknown and the devastating consequences it can bring. The virus would continue spreading, and soon the entire Western Hemisphere would be filled with the walking dead.